Good morning, everyone. Hope you all rested well. As always, we see these Mellon scholars, you faculty scholars, know how to party. I was a little worried. I said, I hope they'll come this morning after that last night. Yeah. But no, we're just so happy that everyone had a really good time last night, and I think that we've gotten off to a wonderful start. So I'm just going to do a few housekeeping matters, and then I'm going to turn it over to this distinguished panel. First of all, we want to thank Jim in the back. He's just doing a wonderful job and supporting us with our AV, so we really appreciate you. And just, this is very important that the AV works, and we always say we want a technician in the room. We don't want to have to call anyone, so we really appreciate that. I also wanted to let you all know that this session, as well as the other sessions for today that will be in this room, will be videotaped. And so if anyone has any questions or concerns about that, you can let me know. But we're beginning the videotaping this morning. We think that we're just going to have such rich conversations, and so we wanted to be able to capture them. And each year, after the end of the conference, someone says, you should have videotaped it, and we say, oh yeah, we should have. And then Dr. Kiba Harper mentioned it to me earlier this week, and I said, okay, well, let's make that happen. So we have Mr. Bill Ranson here, who's going to be taking care of it. So we really appreciate Bill being here for us. Okay, so I think that I'm going to turn the panel over now to Dr. Vincent Willis. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As Dr. Spence said, I am Vincent Willis. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Alabama, and I'm also a servant leader at the Summer Institute. So I want to, So I want to begin, first of all, by reiterating what I said yesterday at the pre-conference. So as we're going through these sessions, if you're thinking about students that you want to, apply for the program, please, jot this down. We just don't want to lose the energy by the time the applications are submitted in January, I believe, right, Dr. Spence? So if there's a colleague that's not here that you think would like to be here, who want to nominate a student, just email, jot stuff down. We just don't want to, again, lose energy in the room. And so before I get started, I want to say my debt of gratitude to Dr. Spence, Dr. Eldridge, and Ms. Ada, who puts on such a wonderful conference every year. So we can give them a round of applause. I greatly appreciate it. And so it's interesting. I was thinking about what I would say, and as I would introduce this panel, I was in thinking about the theme of a construction site and how Dr. Spence and her team makes the Westin a construction site of transformation every year. And when the social scientist and or humanist writes the story of the summer program, or the story of what's going on in a little office at Spelman, as Dr. Spence said yesterday, now they will have videotape for archival data, so we appreciate that as well. And so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce this panel, and then I'm going to get out the way, and then Dr. Hobson will come and moderate, and then we will have a full discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Waite. Am I saying that right? Okay, Dr. Waite, who is Associate Professor of History and Education at Teachers College at Columbia University, and Program Director of the Mellon Mays Graduate Initiative Program in Social Science Research and Counsel. And she does a lot of work with the Summer Institute as well. She pretty much comes, I believe, every year, right, to talk to students about it. She's the author of Permission to Remain Among Us, Education for Blacks in Oberlin, Ohio, from 1880 to 1914. So if we can give a great round of applause for Dr. Waite. Okay, and now next we have Dr. Hodge Clark, who is a Spelman grad, 2004. I believe a Mellon Fellow as well. Yes. All right. And so Dr. Hodge Clark is the Director of Research, Association of Governing Boards of the University and Colleges, and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. She develops and executes the association strategic research agenda on a range of issues, including enterprise risk management, governing board, and structure and culture, right, on campus. So let's give her a round of applause. And so I'm going to save Dr. Hodge's introduction because I think him and Dr. Anderson are unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, interconnected in this transformative work. And so, there's Dr. Anderson's bio, but I won't bore you with that. I want to kind of say what Dr. Anderson is to me and to most of us. And this won't take long with Dr. Anderson. So I met Dr. Anderson before I met him. So like most of you, I met him through his seminal work, The Education of Blacks in the South. And one of the things that I learned early on is that I had to rethink what I thought about not only slavery, but enslaved people after slavery. And so Dr. Anderson taught me early, even before I knew him, about ways to make provocative and very empirically sound, arguments. And so even last week in my introduction to African American course, we used his seminal text, and similar to what Armando was saying yesterday about like people, marginalized people, particularly African Americans, have been into this transformative work for centuries. And so I appreciate the way in which these unintentional ideas have seemed to be interconnected even early on in our work. And so once I met Dr. Anderson, I knew he was a big time scholar, but even meeting him taught me how to be intentional about these kind of transformative works. And so when I met him, I used to ask him just questions about like, well, why did you stay at the University of Illinois or Urbana-Champaign so long? And he was always responded about he was really concerned about if you want to institutional build, you have to stay somewhere. And so I just want to publicly appreciate Dr. Anderson for being intentional about the production of what he's done at the University of Illinois. And of course, now he's the big time dean. So let's give it up for Dr. Anderson. And of course, you can't talk about an institutional building without empirical evidence. And so Dr. Hobson is one of many people that, I asked Dr. Anderson last night how many PhDs have he produced. And of course, he had no idea because, the numbers, have grown so greatly. And so Dr. Hobson is one of Dr. Anderson's, products, right? That this transformative building is now in action. So I want to welcome Dr. Hobson to the stage. We appreciate you. And without further ado, here is Dr. Anderson.
Well, good morning. And thanks for the invitation. I am enjoying learning more and more about the UNCF Fellows, Mellon Fellows. I knew about the Mellon program. I didn't know about the UNCF Mellon program. And it's something that has been probably as important to my career as anything, because we have a kind of counterpart at Illinois, and actually it's throughout the Big Ten Academic Alliance. It's called the Summer Research Opportunity Program. And it started in 1986, and I heard about it. I didn't have a mentee the first year, so I started with mentees in 1987, and it's had not a mentee, but mentees every summer. And this past summer was my 30th consecutive year of having that. But I agree with Dr. Spence when she said we need to focus in on the undergraduates. When I saw the opportunity to mentor undergraduates in research programs, I knew it was important for them. And I also think we should point out that it's important for us. It reinvigorates us. It's rewarding. I mean, it's one of the things that when we see them go on to great careers, there's nothing that makes us prouder. But also I knew that if you're going to get the top quality master's and doctoral students, this is the place to begin. You don't wait until they apply to graduate school and then sort through applications. You start to work with them in the undergraduate years, and we certainly have enough experience, and we've actually graduated in my department. I'm no longer department head, I'm now dean. I regret leaving the department because it keeps you closer to students, but up until last year, we had graduated certainly well over 100 PhDs from my department who were participants in the SROP program. They come in, they have a very good idea what research is all about. They know how to select and find research topics, and they can move through their graduate programs at a much quicker pace than that. So, so I'm happy to find out about this dimension of the Mellon program. We've been recruiting Mellon scholars from the beginning, but now I can focus in more purposely on UNCF Mellon. We'd like to have some graduate students at Illinois out of this program. I looked at the topic this morning, and it really caused me to do a lot of reflection, because I've done work on the history of African American education, on the history of black higher education, and have been working on HBCUs in many ways. Not only the writing and research, but also as an expert witness in some important federal cases and Supreme Court cases around the very survival and development of HBCUs. So my first case was Knight versus Alabama, which was a higher ed desegregation case about public education in the state of Alabama, involving mainly Alabama State University and Alabama A&M on the one hand, and of course University of Alabama, Auburn, and the traditional white institutions on the other hand. And so in preparation for that expert testimony, I learned a lot about the origins and development of public institutions for African Americans in the state of Alabama. I went to Stillman College, and so we kind of operated in a UNCF circle with Talladega and Miles and Tuskegee institutions like that. But it was critical to know a lot more about the public institutions. And also, my book ends roughly 1930s, 35, and so as an expert witness, you can't stop in 1935. The court makes it very clear that the distant past is not relevant in these cases, so you have to bring it up to the time of the case. So I did a lot of work on HBCUs, public HBCUs. And then the second case was Ayers v. Fordyce in Mississippi, and that was special. Mississippi is always special, as Nina Simone tells us. So it was special in this case, but it was really interesting to get a good sense. And I won't go into much detail, but you know, Alcorn was the first land grant in the state of Mississippi, and it's older than Mississippi State. And it's also the case that when Alcorn opened, both black and white students went to Alcorn. And some people often portray HBCUs as existing because they couldn't go to white institutions. And that's not the history of Alcorn. They both went to Alcorn until you got the reactions later in the 19th century where whites redeemed the South and took a Jim Crow stance and ended those kinds of practices. It was also the case that early on, Alcorn got the same kind of state and federal money as Mississippi State, because Mississippi State was formed shortly thereafter. Now, at the time that case occurred, one of the things that struck me was that the value of Alcorn University, and this was in mid-1990s when we were in the federal district courthouse in Oxford, the value of Alcorn University, the total value of it, was worth less than the agricultural experiment station at Mississippi State University. So set aside the university. And so it was a stark contrast of ways in which the state had underdeveloped the Alcorn State University as a land grant versus Mississippi State. And so I started to think differently about the work that needs to be done on HBCUs. This topic here makes me think even more about it, because when I saw the emphasis on the significance of HBCUs as sites of academic and intellectual excellence, I thought, well, who did the work on this one? You know? And I said, well, I didn't, and others did, because we were focused on a lot of other things, the kinds of struggles that I just talked about, how HBCUs got off the ground and the struggles that they made to survive, some being founded by former slaves, enrollment trends, financial trends, leadership changes, and sometimes student life and culture that revolved around sports and other sorts of things are the kinds of things that we took up. But in some ways, we forgot to focus in on the most significant mission and attributes of HBCUs, and that's as sites of academic and intellectual excellence, is what they have done right from the beginning. That's been their mission. Now, some of that's going to change. I do know of some forthcoming works. It's not going to focus on academic and intellectual excellence in the way that this theme does and the way that I'm thinking about it. But I know Jelani Favors is doing a book. He was at a conference on kind of a 50-year commemoration of the civil rights movement and of all the leaders and student leaders and activists who literally changed America. And there were a lot of young people there, and the young people were somewhat disappointed at the conference because no one could explain to them how we got to 1960 with AT&T and the strikes and so forth. And so they were wondering, well, what happened in HBCUs over the years, over the decades? What happened intergenerationally that produced these leaders? They didn't just suddenly spring out of nowhere. And so he's now writing a manuscript going back to the 19th century to look at the faculty in HBCUs as well as the students in HBCUs and the intimate and private relationships between faculty and students that over time led to this long freedom struggle, which we now know as the modern civil rights movement of the 1960s. It's going to be a really wonderful book that he will focus on. And one of the things that I notice he will do is that the kind of critique of HBCUs as being conservative institutions and the kind of critique of many professors as being accommodations, he will completely reframe that and revive that, because he's able to go, and he started with 19th century colleges. He comes through, and he's selected institutions. I think Bennett is one of them, Stores, I think Tougaloo, others he's going to look at as sites, and he will demonstrate that these things took place in the 19th century, and it was building over many decades and many college generations. So there is an explanation as to how we got to 1960 and how we got to the Voting Rights Act of '65 and the work of SNCC and others, and that's going to be a wonderful contribution. Also, I think the video that will premiere in February, Tell Them That We Are Rising, by Stanley Nelson, it won't deal specifically with this theme, but there will be things in there that would reflect on it. One thing I know, it will make you make you a very proud graduate of an HBCU. And in reviewing the film, and also participating. There are a couple of clips in me in there. I always try to avoid the camera, but I end up on the camera even when I don't want to. But it's amazing what he does. I went to New York and he got an Uber up to his place. I thought there was going to be this grand studio where he did the Freedom Riders and the Black. I go upstairs into his house, and there's this little room and a chair. And I was like, this is amazing. Award-winning producer in this thing. And I told him, I said, this is kind of like an HBCU. But I found out that his parents went to Tuskegee, graduated from Tuskegee, and he actually credits them for his own success. And he's always wanted to make that kind of contribution. But what at the end, we have to send him reviews. And it will make us all proud to be graduates, and it will deal with struggles, and it doesn't romanticize. It deals with some of the difficult things, like the murders at Southern and Jackson and the Orangeburg Massacre and things like that. They're in there. But it's also the case that when you leave HBCUs and go out to the rest of the country, they actually have this view that HBCUs exist somewhere on the periphery of higher education. And they don't know one HBCU from another. I always tell people when I got to Illinois, directly out of Stillman, and they said, why did you go to undergrad? I said, actually, Stillman. They said, oh, Spelman. And I would respond with a smile and say, I wish. And they had no idea what I was talking about. And then they would do write-ups on me there, and they would say, he's a graduate of Spelman. And so I kept saying, no, it's Stillman. Then I realized that they really don't have an understanding of HBCUs. But what this film, Tell Them That We Are Rising, will do, it will remind the whole country on PBS that HBCUs have been at the center of shaping and reshaping this nation, and that you can't possibly imagine the American that we have today without the role of HBCUs and of their graduates and alumni and what they have done. And we've seen some of this, like the work on Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston, and how they changed American law and a reading of the American Constitution with Brown v. Board of Education. But this actually goes even broader. So I think that's one of the things that will come across in the film. And I should point out, I assume everybody knows where the film got its name from. Tell them that we're rising, but just in case, it originates in Atlanta. And it happened in 1868 when General O.O. Howard, for whom Howard University is named, had a group of Northerners who were touring the South in 1868, same year that the 14th Amendment was ratified. And they were trying to get a sense of the conditions of former slaves and how African Americans were doing. And so they go to Atlanta University, and Wright is there, not as a college student. He's 13 years old then, Richard Wright, who goes on to be president of Savannah State here in this state. So they asked the question to the class, what shall we tell the people up north about the conditions of the former slaves, and they would say of colored people? And the 13-year-old Wright stood and said, sir, tell them we're rising. And that's where the saying comes from. It actually resulted in a poem too, as well. So that's the name of the video, and it's going to be really great to see. And when I think about it, it's one of the few times where the whole nation gets to look in on HBCUs to get some sense of their history, their role, and their contributions. Now, the topic today on the significance of sites of construction is of HBCUs as sites of academic and intellectual excellence is a good historical question. It's more than a theme. It's a very good historical question. What would we study? What would we look at? And why is it that we do not know this? Now, I've noticed, because I tried to read every institutional history of HBCUs when I was writing the book. So a history of Howard, a history of Lincoln, history of Southern University. There were so many institutional histories out there. But in many cases, it's the genesis and rise and triumph of the institution against Herculean odds, because there were so many efforts to try to underdevelop them or close them down. And I noticed that even the authors of that tend to gauge academic and intellectual excellence in HBCUs by what their graduates accomplished when they left HBCUs. So at the end, or somewhere in the book, they would say for Fisk University graduates, they went on to do this and that, and they got PhDs and MDs. But no one talked about the academic and intellectual excellence while they were at HBCUs. And no one talks about who were their professors and what did they teach them and how did they make a decision as to what to teach. And I remember when I saw the theme, I always think back to Stillman and I grew up in Utah, Alabama. That's 30 miles down the road, graduated from Carver High School, and then went to Stillman as a 17-year-old at Stillman College. And I was a math major then, by the way. A lot has changed, and that's another story. But Stillman had a whole collection of bright students from across the state of Alabama at that time. And what they had done in my freshman year was to try to recruit every valedictorian and every salutatorian of every black high school in the state to be in the freshman class of Stillman. And they got enough. And so I walked in as a valedictorian as well. And you figured you'd done okay in high school. But then there were valedictorians out of Parker High School in Birmingham. That's where Condoleezza Rice went and others. And you go, now they are valedictorians and they're valedictorians. But anyway, at the end of the first semester, I was pretty pleased. I had more than a B average, and I was walking across campus, and I'll never forget my college classmate from Parker High in Birmingham, and she was crying. And I thought, oh my God, the poor child flunked out. So I went over to console her. I said, Scarlett, what's wrong? She says, I just got a B, 1B. So I'm like, what are the rest of your grades? And she looked at me in astonishment. Well, they were all A's, of course. I'm like, so you crying because you got a B? I'm going to go over and play some basketball. This is way beyond me. I'm happy because I got B's. But I tell that because when it comes to academic excellence and people that inspired you, it was the peers at HBCUs, things that you did. And one more Stillman story. Tell you how at the end of our freshman year, we'd all done well, and they were grateful for this class because we our tuition rates, our grades, and so forth. And then they called us over to Birthright Auditorium, wanted the whole freshman class to come, and it was mandatory. And in HBCUs, when something is mandatory, it's mandatory. It's not like I'm gonna miss this, And so we got us there, and they said, look, we're very pleased with your academic performance. And they said, but we are very dissatisfied with your literacy, your literary skills. Okay? So they had these boxes over there. And they said, we want each one of you to go over there. And we had to get 4 books. And they said, when you come back in the fall semester for your sophomore year, if you don't pass the exam on these books, you will not be readmitted to Stillman College. Yeah, that was scary. So, and I never forget the books. This stuff sticks in your mind, right? So, one was Profiles in Courage by John Kennedy. The other one was The Pearl by John Steinbeck. Then there was Lord of the Flies and Catcher in the Rye. And so the summer, you spent your summer reading the book like never before because you understood that you may not get readmitted to Stillman when you got back in the fall. Because we got back in the fall and they never said anything about it. Not a word. Not a word. But now you had a sophomore class, so we're talking to each other about Profiles in Courage and about the meaning of The Pearl and Lord of the Flies. And so the conversations among peers, and so part of understanding academic and intellectual excellence as HBCUs is also to understand peer relationships and peer learning and peer motivation. I would never forget Scarlett Curry because she said, you think you're doing well, but you need to pick it up a notch or two if you're going to be disappointed that you got 1B. And so you go on thinking, yep, you're in some tough competition here, and so you do need to think seriously. That was even the case with the great Thurgood Marshall. If you read his biography, he was at Lincoln. Langston Hughes was there. And Thurgood was not taking his academics very seriously. And Langston Hughes just pulled him aside and said, look, we have a purpose for being here. It's to uplift our people. So you need to get serious. And he did get serious. And we know the rest of the story there. And so I think that is one of the things. The other thing is, and the most important thing, of course, I think, is to zero in on the faculty and HBCUs historically. What were they doing? Why were they doing it? How did they make choices? I never asked the faculty at Stillman, how did you come to the conclusion that we were literally illiterate? And why did you make that choice? And so they made decisions about how to educate us. It didn't matter whether you were a math major or chemistry major or biology major. They had a sense of what an educated person ought to be, and they made decisions along those lines. And so I think that's important to zero in on the faculty over the years and to see. HBCU graduates often talk about their faculty, but their authors would talk about their accomplishments after they left HBCUs. Du Bois, for instance, talked effusively about the faculty at Fisk University when he was there. And yet his authors always go to Harvard and what happened at Harvard, or when he went to the University of Berlin and his publication of the suppression of the African slave trade. But when I first saw his writing on there, because oh yeah, people wrote a lot. They wrote a lot in hand at that time. So he's writing on the cover of his dissertation, suppression of the African slave trade, and so he's a professor at Wilberforce University, and he says he is a professor of ancient languages, not of history, not of sociology. And I'm thinking he learned that at Fisk. His professorship at Wilberforce goes directly from what he learned at Fisk, because Fisk was steeped in the ancient languages. They continued to require Latin and Greek long after many white universities had abandoned that. In fact, they were criticized by many of the philanthropists. They said, what is wrong with these HBCUs? That Harvard has dropped it, but Fisk is still requiring it. And you eventually realize that Fisk does not take its orders from Harvard, nor does it decide how it should educate its students based on what's going on at Harvard. So Du Bois talked a lot about its faculty. There are others who talk about the faculty, but we don't have much knowledge on what the faculty were doing and what they taught their students. And I want to add one more thing to sort of suggest how we, and then close with how we should reframe our study of particular HBCUs. And that is, and I want to go back to Richard Wright as an example. Because Richard Wright was in the first Atlanta University class, graduating class, born a slave, as many of his fellow students were, and was involved in a lot of things in his life. From the 13-year-old statement, he graduated from Atlanta and became principal of what was called the Colored High School in Augusta, Georgia. It was the only black public high school in the state of Georgia. But the high school was later renamed Ware High School, and was at the center of one of the most important Supreme Court cases. And it was Cummins was an African American, versus Richmond County Board of Education. And they discontinued Ware High School, and there was no public tax money for any high schools for blacks in the state of Georgia and in Augusta. So they closed Ware, the whites closed Ware High School. They continued to support a public high school for white women in Augusta, as well as the denominational school for white males, but no high school for African Americans. So they sued. The black parents sued, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that the separate principle in Plessy, separate but equal, was not violated by Richmond County closing the high school for African Americans. And that case was as important as Plessy, because in my view, Plessy established the principle of separate, Cummins established the principle of unequal. You know, that it doesn't have to be equal. They don't have to have a high school. And so following the Cummins case, there was many. But anyway, I want to go back to Wright for another reason. While he was there, in 1883, there was this, when I was doing my research, I discovered that there was this U.S. Senate Committee on Education and Labor. They were touring the South, and they were trying to get as much evidence as they could on conditions of work and education in the southern states. And they were doing that on behalf of what was called the Blair Bill. The Blair, and Senator Blair of New Hampshire had put a bill before the Senate to allocate federal funds to alleviate literacy in the southern region in particular. And so he was having a difficult time getting the bill passed. It did pass the Senate 3 times. It never passed the House of Representatives, because a disproportionate amount of those funds would have gone to African Americans because they had the highest rate of literacy. And so there was considerable opposition in Congress. But anyway, they were touring the South to collect evidence so they get back to the Congress and say, this is what we saw in the South. And so they ran into Richard Wright, and they interviewed him, his sworn testimony before the committee. And they kept asking him questions about work and about education. And somewhere along the way, the conversation switched, and they started to query him about comparative studies on the superiority and inferiority of races. And they asked the young Richard Wright, what do you think about it? So indulge me while I read his response. Here's what Wright said. And I can tell you now, there were no more questions after this. He said, it is generally admitted that religion has been a means of human development and great progress. And I think that about all the great religions which have blessed this world have come from the colored races. And this is what he says to the Senate committee. All the great religions, he said, has come from the colored races. I believe, too, he said, that our methods of alphabetic writing all came from the colored race. And I think the majority of the sciences in the origin have come from the colored races. Now I take the testimony of those people, he's getting very cynical now, I take the testimony of those people who know and who I feel are capable of instructing me on this point, as though he was being instructed. He's actually doing the instruction here. And I find them saying that the Egyptians were actually woolly-haired Negroes. In Humboldt, Cosmos, and then he says, go to volume 2, page 35531. Are you kidding me? You will find that testimony. And Humboldt, I presume, is pretty good authority. Now he's feeding back to them the classics that they've studied at Harvard and Yale and Princeton and saying, I assume you gentlemen think this is a good authority. The same thing, he said, is stated by Herodotus and a number of other authors with whom you gentlemen are doubtless familiar. Now, if that is true, the idea that this Negro race is inherently inferior seems to me to be at least a little limping. And then he closed. At the time I read that, I thought, so who taught him that? At Atlanta University. He was in the first class. And what were they teaching African American students? It's not just the knowledge, but that sense of confidence, not just in himself as an individual, but in his people as a race. And you know, there are 4 volumes of this, and there are a lot of pages, thousands of pages, so I kept looking for a follow-up. There was no follow-up after this. They just left it as it is, and then, you know, and of course, the stenographer was taking all this down. I suspect they probably told the stenographer, just stop right there. But who were the other professors that he studied with? And what did they decide to teach them? You can sense and feel the academic excellence in this response, a learned person, right, and who fears no one. And these people were powerful senators. They had gone to the Ivy League universities. They had great education, and Wright just stares them in the face and say, let me rely on the authorities. Now, the other thing, doesn't it change our notions about the classic